My name is Lars Münter. I am the Network Director of the European Health Futures Forum. And today we are going to, well, I think we are both going to tell stories and we are going to talk about stories. And we're probably going to talk about stories as well. With the overarching purpose, of course, of diving a little bit into the benefit of using a storytelling approach, of also using stories in different settings for different purposes, maybe also in throughout different times as well. Haley and I have at a previous time exchanged stories from our professional past, and of course use that as a cliffhanger to explore stuff as well. So stories have multiple purposes. The purpose of today is thus, though, that we can be a little bit wiser on how to do that, and of course also share with others our passion and also maybe a trick or two when it comes to storytelling. Tobias Gantner will be hopefully joining us as soon as possible, but with me today, we're online, and Haley Hechtman, two, of course, wonderful storytellers and passionate about storytelling as well. So in this context, maybe we can start with you, Haley, and an introduction into, of course, how you use storytelling. And of course, yeah, well, also maybe the future of storytelling, we'll be diving into that. So welcome, and let us hear your story in this respect, Haley.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Great to connect and talk about the power of story. So my name, as you said, is Haley Hechtman. I am the executive director at an organization called Unsinkable. And I have had an interesting path into storytelling. I've worked in the mental health space for my entire career. I started very early on working in crisis lines. I worked in developmental disabilities. I worked in employment and entrepreneurship and mental health. And over the years, I had learned this incredible coping strategy, which is when you work in community with other people, it is often the simplest thing to ignore your own struggles and put those on the back burner. So for a long time, while also simultaneously working in the mental health space, I was struggling with my own mental health. And one day I was in my kitchen, I was cleaning up, I was listening to a podcast, and this woman was sharing her story. She was talking about her experience, her lived experience with an eating disorder. And she was explaining, you know, some of her symptoms, some of her thought patterns, some of the things that she was going through on a daily basis. And it stopped me in my tracks. And it was in that moment I had realized, you know, my own struggle, and I had related so deeply to everything that she was saying that it was a catalyst for me to start my own recovery journey and start to navigate some of the things that I had put off really being honest with myself about for a long time. And that, you know, took a couple of years. And a few years after starting my own recovery journey, I wanted to share my own story. I was so touched by how much that one person's perspective changed my own insight and gave me, you know, an ability to self-reflect and go into my own journey. So I shared my story with Unsinkable. I was introduced to the organization through a colleague, and went through that process, shared my own personal journey, and then a few months later was introduced to the organization as the executive director. It was really the perfect marriage of all the things that I cared so deeply about. And so our work at Unsinkable and where we focus on storytelling really is we're a national charity that uses storytelling to break down stigma, build connection, and inspire healing. Our work takes many forms, from digital storytelling platforms where we've featured over 450 storytellers based in Canada, from across the country, and have reached tens of thousands of people, to supporting individuals in sharing their personal stories safely, confidently, and with purpose. We also run a youth program that's for youth by youth that fosters peer-to-peer conversations about mental health, relationships, and connection. We work with grassroots organizations and leaders across the country to amplify lived experience voices through storytelling projects, through fireside chats, and through events, uplifting the stories that shape and strengthen communities across the country. So that's the vantage point that I am coming from this morning. And really, the takeaway that I hope to get from this conversation is not only the value of storytelling for the audience, but also the incredible value that we've seen in storytelling for the storyteller. That going through this process yourself is an opportunity for self-reflection. It's a chance to rewrite some of the harmful internal narratives that we've internalized, and a chance to share your own experience through a perspective of strength and resilience. So I'm excited to be here.
Thank you so much, Haley. A great introduction for sure. Veron, so what's your story?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. And yes, I'm Veron. I am a designer. I have been living a double life as a designer. One side, I work as a designer by trade, but then at the same time, in the last 10 years, I also work as an educator on design as well. I'm based in London, so let's start with my educator life. In the last 10 years, I have been working in the universities in London called University of the Arts London, where I teach the postgraduate programs in service design. And for those of you who are less familiar with like what service design is, I will try to boil it down into a very quick 30-second version of what that is. In principles, it is really about a human-centric design process. But what service design is trying to look at is not just about the individuals inside the system, but also what product and services are given to them. In the context about public health, is like why these persons is in the systems, who they are, what sort of power they have, and who make the decisions, who they interact with. And on the wider circle, as we're looking at the services, service doesn't come out from nowhere. It's a decisions out from many different layers, particularly in public health. You're looking at government, you're looking at policy, but at the same time, in country where you have diversities, like who is being looked after, who the service is designing for and with, those are the questions that where service design particular exploring. The reason why I thought this is very interesting is also I did a postgraduate in service design 15 years ago, and I started into teaching. Service design is quite new as an academic subject, but at the same time, what is very encouraging as a practitioner as myself, working as a day-to-day, is I start to see the gap is start to narrowing down. And particular in storytelling is, in service design, there's a different methods and process on how to make things happen. But what storytelling is about whose voice matter. And also, are we able to create space for people to share those voices as well? And so this kind of aspect that when I started many years ago as an educator, I kind of looking at this from a very academic standpoint. But what's been very encouraging throughout the years when I start working is how closely I can see it's related to everything that we do day to day, which is very fascinating, but also I will talk more about what are the concerns and opportunities in the future when storytelling starts to scale, that we are starting to see how it applies as applications in different communities, different cultural contexts as well. So that's a bit of a bridge between the academic and the professional side. So on day-to-day, I have been building design team for startup and scale up. And from this year, I have been focusing on my independent design consultancy, which is looking into building design capacities in the public and the private sector as well. So there's a bit of a mixed background, but hopefully I have a lot of interesting story to share later in these conversations.
Super, but for sure also an interesting concept about the combination of service design and storytelling. And maybe also on that particular issue, I mean, even before your great organization of Unsinkable came to be, Haley, clearly people were probably telling stories. So what sort of is the clear benefit of having that structured approach? Is that maybe also either because it's a lost trade maybe that people would need to master? Or is it more like the fact that you like maybe a lens that you concentrate the power of the sun in order to make it even more impactful? Or how do you see the sort of the purpose and the drive behind Unsinkable in the role of storytelling, for sure?
Yeah, great question. And I think, like, yes, the storytelling has been around as long as humans have been around. We all always use stories to understand our environment, to explain our own experiences, to reflect on our past and reflect forward on our future. I think for us as an organization, the benefit of having a more structured approach is because we are supporting people in particular with their mental health, the need to have that support mechanism in place in order for them to feel safe sharing their story publicly is such an important mechanism to not only the process of building out their story, but also to the digital amplification of what that looks like when we put it out in public. And so being able to meet with people where they're at and go through a readiness assessment, seeing where they are in their journey, have they processed some of the things that they've been through, how well do they understand their own mental health experience at this point, what do they want to get out of the story, who are they hoping to reach, what audience do they hope will benefit from hearing their perspectives. All of those questions are really important filters to help us craft their story in a way that has that meaningful impact. Most people reach out to us because they want to give back to community in some way. They heard a story like I had shared my own experience that really changed them. And so being that person for someone else is often the driver of why people come forward and want to share their stories with us, but may not know the best way to do so, or may need support in understanding the complexity of their story in order to figure out what details should be included and maybe what isn't the most important to share. There's also that safety and boundary mechanism where, if someone is sharing a really personal story around a difficult topic related to their mental health, making sure that they know what details will add to the story and what details may trigger someone else that don't need to be included, that don't necessarily move the story forward and actually detract from the emotional resonance that they're trying to bring to life. I think when I think about tech and the future of storytelling and this digital world that we operate in, for me, the work that we do is it's not just stories. It's about lived experience. And when we're amplifying them online, it's really thinking about where and how we share them and how that matters. Not putting them on every platform, thinking about where is the best place to put a story, where will it connect the most is something that we think about quite intentionally as an organization. Where are youth going to be if the story is reflective of youth? Where are entrepreneurs going to be if the story is reflective of them? How do we connect and reach people where they are? And I think for us, in increasingly fast-paced and algorithmic driven digital world, we have a responsibility to protect the people behind the stories and foster meaningful community connection and amplify their voices with care. And so we think a lot about our digital spaces, not looking at our storytellers as content creators, but looking to them as individuals who have lived through struggle, healing, and growth, and many of whom are building up the courage to share their story. So coming at it from an ethical framework is so important, looking at how do we protect the emotional impact of a story, the legacy of a story, how do we prepare a storyteller for what the inevitable response may be from their story being on a digital platform. Sometimes we don't think about that. If we put our story online, we no longer have control over how it's received once it's out there publicly. So working with a storyteller to see, are you in the right mindset? Are you in the right mental space to be able to receive maybe positive or negative feedback around your story once it's on a specific platform, and really focusing on agency, that this is their story, is co-created. It's not created for them by us. It's really a process of how do we amplify the best in their own experience to reach the community that they're hoping to reach. So that's kind of where we're coming from when we're working with storytellers in this format.
So clearly, quite a lot of different ethical questions, but I think most of us by now have figured out that modern social media are really good at encouraging people to do dance moves and so on. Some more than others, for sure. I think I have yet to do that, but still. But do you feel that there's actually a larger potential, though, for also allowing people to be able, now that they have the proverbial 15 seconds of fame opportunity at their fingertips, or at least at their screen, that it also sort of creates a larger sort of movement of people being willing to share stories and slowly moving from untrained into proficient sort of storytellers? Or what, is it easier for you to recruit storytellers because they are more accustomed to it, maybe?
That's it. For us, one thing that we have noticed is that the openness for people to share their story often comes from being inspired by someone else's. That seeing someone else model that approach is often what encourages them to reach out to us. I think a couple of months ago in May, we did a campaign where we brought 15 storytellers together. We recorded portions of their story in audio and in visual, and we shared those on billboards and on radio ads across the country. And we received so many more people interested in sharing their story as a result of that campaign. We think we saw 200% increase in our web traffic just during the month of May, because it gave other people permission to want to do the same thing. So I think that seeing someone else share their story is one of often the biggest catalysts for someone wanting to do that on their own. I think when I look at social media and just our online digital platforms in general, we really, as an organization and just as a philosophy, focus on moving away from our audience as passive consumers of content. Like, people right now, they're on their phone, they're scrolling. It's so easy to get caught in this loop of not meaningfully interacting with anything that you're looking at, that you're having this kind of short form passive scrolling. And so our focus is to interrupt that and invite people in through storytelling as a way to stop the scroll, as a way to encourage them to listen, as a potential change for how they see themselves and other people. And so much of that comes from the way we share stories. It's not just, here's a 15 second out of context video of someone's experiences. We think very intentionally around what will draw someone in, but also what will keep them there. And a great example of that is we did a roundtable around entrepreneur mental health this past summer. We recorded the conversation and we were looking to release the video. The video is 11 minutes. We were told there's no way people are going to stay on the platform for 11 minutes. We should shorten it. We should cut it into bite-sized chunks. We should find ways of making it more consumable. And we really stuck to it and said, no, we think that the right people and the people who really need to hear this message will stay. And we've seen such a positive impact of that longer story because it interrupted the scroll. And I've received hundreds of messages from people about the time that they took to watch that story and how much it deeply impacted them, and hearing those experiences. And many entrepreneurs have reached out and said, this has inspired me to want to be a part of future conversations. Can we host this in my community? Can we bring this to our Chamber of Commerce? So when you talk about what encourages people to share their story, is it seeing an influencer online? Yes and no. I think it's seeing something real is the catalyst for someone wanting to share their story. Seeing someone dance on the internet, that's fun and that's great and that's entertaining. But how do we embed, especially right now when there's AI, there's all these things that are coming to life that are not real? How do we embed that real human spirit? And part of that encourages people to slow down, to process, and to self-reflect.
Thank you. We've been joined also by Tobias Gantner, and moving to you in a second, Tobias. But before we do so, I would just allow Viran to also maybe chip in, because what Haley sort of described here, and of course, if you're looking on the screen, you can see how design and ceramics can combine to a kind of a storytelling as well, because that's the Japanese art of really sort of making a positive story out of something that was broken. But Viran, I mean, how can we maybe also think about designing? Is that sort of also something that, I mean, I know that you previously this year had the element about how to use more storytelling in our engagement with patients. And of course, to some extent, what Haley is describing is also patients or people that are suffering, but mostly you're dealing with citizens. But designing for better processes that would allow both the system, but also the practitioners to use that. What's your ideas about how we design for a better use of the methods?
Yeah, it is a very, very interesting question. And I have been reflecting a lot about like what I understood from storytelling in the design process is actually there's two flows. One is story as the outcome of the design. So it's the experience that you design as a product and services. But more likely, the part that I find it really, really interesting is actually the process of it. But I will start with the outcome of it first, because as a designer, when I start working in the space of medicals and healthcare, very often I reflect on like many, many years ago when I started working, it's like, well, I don't have a medical degree. And then you're kind of thinking like, what can I do as a designer by the time that I don't have all these like rigors of scientifics? Like, what is the role of a designer? And from the very early days, I remember at that time, what design being seen in the space of healthcare and medical is like making things look pretty so that people are going to look at it. And so that is like very early days, a starting point of like, oh, can you make an app? If you remember about 16 years ago when like medical apps start to appear on App Store, it's like, it's pure reminder. Can you make something look interesting? Can you gamify the experience? And that is the very early days of what designers starting to really get involved into the healthcare. But slowly and very quickly, I found what the turning point was, it's not just about adding an additional layer of what being designed, it's actually having a different perspective of the conversations about health and experience. And some of the product that I was very lucky to work in is one of them is actually a femtech product, is a pelvic floor trainer and a wearable breast pump. And if you're looking at the science and the mechanic of it, it's nothing's like kind of groundbreaking, but it's the narrative of using the product. We tell a different stories about the body. We tell a different stories about how women can talk about their health. And that is a turning point that I start to not only the company I work with, but also many other medicals innovations is not particularly just focusing on the scientific innovations, but actually finding a different narrative on how people can engage with the product and the services using a much more creative storytelling approach of like, hey, it doesn't have to be looking like this. It's a different way of telling the story. So that's what I see have been taking off really, really interesting. But at the same time, what I find is something to do with the future of storytelling, particularly from the design and the innovation space, is the process of storytelling, how it takes part in the design process. So which is related to the service design aspect I talk about is how do we create space for conversations to happen, which Haley, you touch on, like about the ethical approach, about trust, about the environment, about really providing the space of care of, are you actually at the mental stage you would like to talk about the stories? Do people have the understanding of what story being shared? But at the same time, as a partner or organizations, when you capture those stories, like how do you build trust? Like how do you make people trust you that when people share the story with you, you're not going to misinterpret it. At the same time, you give them the right to understand like what this information is for, how it's being used, do they have visibilities around that? And I start to see this is really interesting and challenging at the same time, because if I'm thinking about like 18 years ago, all we do as a design company or design team, design capacity is to making things look pretty, to now we start to stepping into a very runnable space of people start to share the story with you. How do you create a space of trust? Which is encouraging, but also concerning at the same time, that it's great to see a lot of the public health organizations start to build design capacity. But do we have the understanding of how do we build trust, let alone having designer or not? It's generally like, how do we allow those voice happening? But at the same time, is the ethical aspect of whose information, who owns it, and what are we do with those information? So that is a part that I have one very small example, which I thought is fascinating. I would love to share is design tools of storytelling about empowerment process is something that started in the northern part of the world. And what's been really interesting as a design educator is that when I start teaching with a very international group of students, they learn all these design tools and case studies have been working in generally Northern Europe, North America. And then when they take the tools back to South America, Southeast Asia, and they start to have the problem of the tool doesn't work. And the tool doesn't work is not the tool itself, it doesn't work, is the consideration of culture and diversity of what is trust, what is safe, how people would like to express themselves are different. And so I definitely see that is a massive potential when people start to work in public health or global health in the global south. Do not just take the tools or storytelling technique that seems to be working in other countries, really considering what is trust, and Haley would say about like consent, ethical approach, trust building community, all these aspects about storytelling will be completely a new disciplines that we need to start learning and also start to have the cultural sensitivities about building trust for story to happen. So that's kind of the two aspects about like storytelling in the design process that I find it really, really interesting. That's a lot of potential, but there's some sort of tricky applications that we really need to be handled with care, because when we break trust, it's very hard to recover.
Absolutely. Mindful also in some of when you maybe also be reading books, sometimes you are subjected to storytelling where the storyteller are sort of clearly using a different technique that you weren't accustomed to, and you find yourself questioning both in terms of times and motives, how to interpret the story in the first place. But thank you so much, Viran. We'll come back to certainly some of those issues for sure. But for a while, let's move on to Tobias, our wonderful German friend. That's kind of also alluding in the background a little bit to what he'll be talking about today. But Tobias, welcome, and let's hear also your story about storytelling.
My
as
story
an
about
intro.
storytelling. Thank you so much. Yeah, I had the if you want to hear my story about storytelling, I had the pleasure to have gone to a classic lyceum, educated in Latin and Greek, and obviously the Greeks were great storytellers, and so this is where I learned the rope about storytelling and how important it is for human beings, and how their culture and what they lived up to is reflected in stories. I am an avid collector of stories. I like all these little wisdom stories that have been collected, for instance, by Anthony de Mello. You probably know Anthony de Mello and his treasure trove of stories. And I'm a medical doctor by training. I run a company called Healthcare Futurists, and I also have a professorship for digital health and innovation. And what I do is I try to challenge the status quo and try to see innovation potential in our everyday life. And so I had a project going on in a senior citizen home, which was about telemedicine. So we installed telemedicine devices. We spoke with nurses. We basically trained nurses to become doctors because of a scarcity of doctors in rural areas. And I spent some time in the nursing home. And nursing homes can be awkward places. And I was lucky enough to have been in a place that wasn't awkward. But people, when I was sitting with people that lived there, they were telling me the stories. Like they were talking about, oh, do you remember this happened and that happened? And so they told the story. And I was just reminded of my grandfather, who nobody could stand at some certain point in time when he was mumbling about what happened in the war, and people were like, oh my God, he's telling stories about the war, and nobody paid attention. And now we regret it because he's long gone and nobody has recorded his stories, and we just don't know what happened at that time. We just don't know. We have a blind spot basically. So long story short, that's where I conceptualized the idea of Lebenswerk.ai, which is what you see in the background. Lebenswerk is German word for work of life or your life's work. And the idea is, in contrary, as you prompt an AI and ask the AI stuff, we have the AI prompt people and ask them about their lives, which we understand is called biography work and is part of nursing. So in nursing school, you learn how to do biography work, which is the reason why we read a number of books about biography work, and we compiled 1,800 questions. And of course, you don't need to go through all these questions. We have 12 chapters, which are in a chronological order. So you start like your early childhood and you end with where you are now. And the AI is basically asking you 10 questions each and has 15 layers, which can then drill down. Like you have a pet, what's its name? What did you do with the pet? Are there any other stories? So this is what we do. And we have started to work with nursing homes. And actually, the one nursing home that where I had this idea is also our first customer. And we're now going into other nursing homes. We have finished the app. The app is in the Apple Store and the Google Play Store. It's as of today strictly B2B. Why? Because we wanted to prevent the huge fees that the Apple Store charges. So basically what we do is we give out a QR code, you scan the QR code, you download the app, you scan it once again, and you're in the app. And then that's good for nursing homes because sometimes people share a device. So you have 5 or 7 or more people telling their life stories in one device. So you don't want this to be mixed up. So you basically scan the QR code, you're in the database, and you just pick off where you left off or pick up where you left off. That's quite interesting. So some people really have a good time, and then they speak with the program. Others have a problem. And this is why we, for instance, connect Bluetooth earphones with like, you know, the old telephone thing that you had back in the day, that we connect that with the smartphone or a tablet. That works very nicely. We gather a lot of experience, like people don't want to talk about the war, so we have integrated a skip button, so, you know, stuff you don't want to talk about. In German, it's a big thing to say "sie" and "du", which is to say, you know, the colloquial form and the more informal form. The AI in German would always address you as "du", which is the very formal form, but senior citizens don't like that, so they want to be addressed with "sie". So we had to reprogram that so that the AI starts being more distant. And what we came about is also that we can generate nursing executive summaries, basically, from the books, like what are my values, what are my attitudes, what do I like, what is it I don't like, things like that. And this already goes into the patient chart. So for new nursing stuff, to read through it, or for people that have already progressed in dementia and where you don't have any way of understanding why the person is reacting this and that way, that can also be very helpful. We have a partnership with hospice, and they are very interested in patient declarations. So we are trying to pre-fill patient declarations, like what is it that I want, what is it that I do not want, coming from these books. The books are multilingual, so we have tried them in the US. So we have a small pocket in the US of a couple of friends of ours who've gone through the book. But we also can do them in Turkish and in any other language, which is interesting because some senior citizens that come from the Turkish community are better off speaking Turkish at one point in time, and the translation will be, or the edit will be done in German. And last thing, we have also started to embark a little bit into outcomes research. I call that narrative-based AI-supported outcomes research. So it's I try to coin a new science, probably, which is we go through the books. We've got the texts in the books. So this is one of the books here, for instance. So and it's a physical book you get. So we go through the text, and we can ask questions to the texts, like what really makes you happy in life? Are there any regrets you have? Stuff like that. So we try to do some research with this, accompanying other kinds of research where we can probably dig out patient-reported outcomes at one point in time, which is also very helpful in order to learn more about medical interventions down the road. Yeah, so that's it. Price point right now is we're looking at between 250 euros per book. We don't we don't print books. We give people EPUB files or PDF files, and then they can go off with books on demand. This gentleman, for instance, wanted his book to have an ISBN number and to be published and buyable on Amazon. for instance. Other people just only want one book. Yeah, so this is why we got out of that. We have been addressed by funeral homes. They put that on their shelves already. So if you plan your funeral, and then you can also go through your biography. And we have a couple of other ideas on how to progress, for instance, in the B2C market. But as of today, we are looking for senior citizen homes that want to partner with us and that are able to pay these 200 to 250 euros out of pocket. It's not a medical device. We don't intend it to be a medical device at some point in time, because this will take forever and a day. Yeah, and that's how we conceptualize Lebenswerk.ai. And I'm very happy for any idea you have, or for any international outreach, for any research partnership, whatever you want to do. I'm open to working with you. And last thing, the kintsugi part. Yeah, I like kintsugi. I started kintsugi, so I have this kintsugi kit, and I think life is really something like this pottery, you know, that has cracks here and there, and we try to piece them together and line them up with gold. So it just like, yeah, it's a scar. Yes, it's a scar. It's my life, and I have scars in my life, and so I can very much also relate to, Haley, what you said about the mental health things for entrepreneurs. I'm an entrepreneur myself, and I know there are sometimes hardship that you go through. And so it's not being perfect. It's not the perfect biography, but it's the I try to democratize biography work. So you don't have to be an archbishop or a rich person, but everybody can contribute. And that's what Lebenswerk.ai is about.
Thank you, Tobias. And clearly from your story, we know that you consist of a lot of gold. And so with a smile.
A lot of cracks.
A lot of cracks. But it leads quite interestingly to a point that Viran made earlier as well. And I would love to hear your thoughts about that too, Haley. The element of the impact on the storyteller, and how, for instance, one of the things that we've been looking at also is how to more methodically require of certain people that they should begin by telling their story, because the telling of the story is also the pathway to healing in itself. And to begin with, many of them are sometimes distraught. They're confused. Their story doesn't actually have a point sometimes, and of course, it's a reflection of their self-reflection as well. That the story doesn't have a point at that time, but over time, they develop a story that then heals them. But you mentioned that, Viran. So I'm curious. You said about the impact on the storyteller. Is that the same? Is that really sort of a way of doing a kintsugi, but for yourself? So is that it?
I think that the experience I see about this one is a slightly different angle from it, because it's kind of like the sort of who telling the stories and who voice being captured, and particular in the world that many of the public health and even governments, and I believe that has been sort of widely adopted in different places, particularly in the UK. I'm sure it's been pretty much championed in the Nordic country as well, in Denmark, Sweden, and also in Germany. Like you start to see like governments and also public health start to engaging with patients into the conversations and sharing the story on shaping policy design, service design, product design, or even like some of the very interesting case studies about hospital design as well, like really getting people to involve or having conversations. What are you imagining? And so I think from looking at that perspective, what I have been seeing firsthand, and even the part that I take part into it, is that it's great that this process of allowing different people's story on shaping what is the future holds, which is fascinating and great. But because of the process is quite a sort of means to the end, meaning like when you start created the process, you engage with people, very often we start to see people who got the skills and the ability to tell the stories, and they will take part into it. And so I remember firsthand when I started working in London for multiple different organizations, from citizen advice all the way to early health family services. I see a particular group of very, very enthusiastic champion who will take part in multiple workshops. So their voice, they get used to using their voice of shaping how the product and services, and they do represent those community. However, I think that the points that Lars, you talk about, and Haley, you talk about as well, is like, what if people who don't have the confidence, they don't have the skills of telling the stories? And what if they don't have the abilities and they don't even know that exists to begin with? And I think that's what Tobias is trying to address, is like, how can we sort of open up that process? And in terms of my experience as a designer or working consulting for large organization or small organizations, like, how do we recruit people into the process? But not only about that, it's like, how do we create a process people can really tell that genuine like story about themselves? And what is that takes? Because there's a combinations about literacies on health literacy, general literacy, let alone if many of the stories have now been moved to digital literacy. So that's a multiple layer about literacies on what are the tools you enabling those voice being captured need to take into considerations. And I think that is the part that I find it is going to be the next iterations in terms of how innovations and design process looks like. If we want to capture these voices, don't just start with the tools that it looks like is working. For example, in the past sort of 15, 20 years, what I've been seeing is like creating this focus group and story groups, using this sort of art form, art therapies, different ways of letting people to expressing themselves. But I start to see there is the limit about this technique, is that not everyone's got the capacity or capabilities to express themselves in those medium, let alone what Haley was mentioning about the mental capacities, about are they actually at the stage that they're able to express themselves. So I'm really, really interested to hear if any others, particular Haley, your experience, like how do you create more arena to allow story to be shared? I do think that it's not just about space. I also think there's people involved, like who is the person who captured the story matters a lot, with the trust building. So I start to see that is taking shape, and we are exploring in the academic space. But yeah, so that's my take about like how stories and where story, but also the implications about storytelling.
Well, a good reporter's always been told you should follow the story. So let's just do that. Haley, what would be your response to that good question, or
Yeah.
sorry?
So thank you for that, Varun. I think for us as an organization, I completely agree that who is involved in the process is very critical in terms of building trust, connection, rapport. So for example, earlier, we typically, over the last number of years, since we started in 2019, we worked with people very much one-on-one on their storytelling process. And in the last year, we've shifted to offer group storytelling programming, where we're bringing together a group of people with similar lived experience to go through this process collectively. And as part of that group, we always have a co-facilitator from that community who is not only supporting the facilitation, but who's adapting the material to align with the needs, the cultural perspectives, what will resonate and reflect the community that we're connecting with and serving, versus us, copy paste a program for a different community each time. So always having involvement from that community, always having a resource partner from that community as well, because at the end of the day, there is nothing worse, especially when you're navigating your mental health, than hearing a story and then not having a place to go next. And so we always work with a community organization, a resource organization who specifically provides support in that community to be a next best step for someone who is sharing their story, and also for the audience that's receiving it. a big part of the process for us is also how are we as an organization, whether it's individual stories, whether it's sharing as a group, whether it's events, how are we always being mindful of having as many diverse voices represented as possible within the stories that we share? Because at the end of the day, people connect most deeply with someone that they relate to, that they resonate with, that they feel that they share lived experience with. We've seen that time and time again where you can share a story. And yes, there is something deeply resonant that we can connect to in everyone's story. We don't have to share all of the lived experience in order to feel the emotions that they're feeling and relate to them in some way. But especially when the difference is between struggling alone and accessing support, one of the biggest linkages is seeing someone that you connect to, that you relate to, talk about that experience and make it safe for you to do so. So a big priority for us as an organization is always thinking about representation within our story. We also focus on modeling. So almost all of our team have shared our own story, that someone, if they're connecting with us, can read or watch our story first, so that we're not coming at a place where there's a power differential where I know a lot about you and you know nothing about me. There's this reciprocation that we build into the program so that someone is automatically coming into a storytelling experience knowing someone about the person guiding them through that process. And we've also built into that program as well a mentorship component. So even if you're going through the process as a group with other people, you also have an individual mentor that you're working with who comes from that community, who shared their story, who maybe has shared their story in the modality that you're looking at, because that's a big component as well of finding a modality that people feel most comfortable with, whether that's a written format of their story, whether it's a video, whether it's an interview, whether it's on stage, whether it's poetry or artwork. We give people the option to choose the storytelling format so that it resonates most with their own experience and feels most comfortable. And I think the other big thing for us that comes back to what you were saying, Lars, around the experience for the storyteller is that we're really mindful never to share a story with the intention of presenting a before and after. Because we know mental health, we know our lived experience is not linear, that we will go through different ebbs and flows, that there is no, here is someone who is struggling, now their life is perfect. That dichotomy is really harmful. And so for us, it's looking at not only how do we speak to the non-linearity of mental health, but also how do we capture stories at different points in the continuum. So we're not just working with people who've shared their story, 10 years after an event happened to them and they're in this good place and they've developed all these strategies. We're looking at who is someone one step removed from the challenge that they face, so that the person who's one step behind them can be inspired, because that balance between aspiration and relatability is so critical. If we're only sharing stories that feel like this epitome of success and someone has moved mountains and they're in this incredibly vibrant place, someone who's struggling is not going to connect with that, even if there's all of these other factors that feel familiar to the storyteller. So having that recognition that it's not just about the representation of the person's lived experience, it's also presenting mental health stories at different points in someone's journey so that the person just behind them can connect with one step forward.
Super. And clearly, we're lucky enough today that we're also joined by our good colleague David Summit, an experienced storyteller himself, I'd say, but also his professional practice. He's heard a yarn or two, I'm sure. So also from your background, and maybe you should, of course, add a word or two, David, about your professional background, because that makes sense for people to. I don't think Haley, for instance, have met you before, so it makes sense why I'm saying that. What's the relation here you have to this tool of storytelling, David?
It's very complicated. It's such a rich area, and I'd concentrate on two things really, just to be a quick intervention. I worked for many years as a forensic psychiatrist, so I listened to the stories of people who had committed very terrible crimes, to understand them, but also The other thing was I trained as a psychoanalyst, so I've also worked as an individual therapist for people. And you know, the thing that struck me about the mental health arena is what we've heard about, and it's very worthwhile indeed, but it seems like it's a kind of problem-solving issue, whereas for me there's another element of the storytelling thing, which is about getting hold of what the emotional background is, to be able to relate emotionally to what the person is saying. It doesn't involve disclosure necessarily, but actually just making allowing the other person to feel understood. And I think that's a very critical aspect of when one is listening to another person's story. What I would move on to is the other one of the many hats I've had, which is in relation to what Veron was talking about, which is, I thought it was extremely interesting. You know, I know Veron and very much value what she's been doing. And that I thought that was this thing as a teacher and contrasting cultures, I think is incredibly important. You know, I had experience with my system change hat, talking to people who very sophisticated academics who'd worked in the field in the what we used to call the third world. I'm sure there's a different word now, but the majority world or whatever, of going to help people change the way they did agriculture in order to deal with climate change. And the amazing thing these guys didn't seem to get is that they didn't adapt to the person's culture. So they were bringing the tools that made sense academically, and they could demonstrate them to the people on the ground and get them to adopt them. But of course, as soon as they went away, they stopped using them you know, because they didn't actually own them, and they hadn't been translated, you know, in a way that adapted to the realities of the culture they lived in. I think that's really an important lesson for us. The third thing I'd say is I'm involved with the wellbeing economy because it's a whole, again, thing about narratives and how we need to help people think in a different way, even to think at all about the economy. But, you know, because most people don't, other than can we afford this or what are they doing to me with the tax and so on, but is actually having a different kind of economy that meets people's needs and society. And what we're doing in Ireland, which is where I'm working with a WeAll so-called hub, is using creative processes to influence the narrative. So we're having, you know, painters, filmmakers, singers, you know, musicians, and so on, to try and change the narrative that way, so that they're engaging people using a different medium to help think about things like the economy in a different way. And I think that's also, I think, worth chucking into the stew, as it were, because I think it's fun, but it's also, you know, it's the problem about the words and written words in particular is they are terribly constraining in a way, and that's the whole thing about people's literacy and all that sort of stuff. People can, however intelligent, quotes, educated you are, people relate to a song in a way, wherever they come from, and the messages it might contain. I think it's a helpful idea also, but I've said enough.
It's a really important point, also connecting to Haley's point about modalities. And of course, we might have sometimes a tendency to think of storytelling as something that involves words, but they need not actually do that. I remember having seen a wonderful storytelling in the shape and form of a dance where the dancer was in a bed sheet, so I couldn't even see the dancer, but still there was a powerful story to be shared. Thinking of the clock, another powerful storyteller in our lives, I have a question for each of you, but that sort of relates to the element also about both the ability to build trust, but also the challenge that we have. And let me maybe start with you, Tobias. There's an element here, of course, about if you allow people to share their story, this is a wonderful mechanism to allow them to feel sort of more focused. They might feel more empowered. They might feel more engaged. But what happens if we don't listen as well? And of course, I'm not talking about the three of you. I'm hoping you're listening. But still, if we as society or feel that if we open up to these mechanisms that we don't know, so listen. So how do we sort of engage and make sure that they listen too as well, Tobias?
Honestly, I don't have an answer, but I think it's about the listening part, what drives me to push Lebensweg AI further. I talked about my grandfather, you know, who got on people's nerve telling about the war because nobody wanted to listen to his story. I think the listener also gives a donation because he or she donates his or her time, right? So this is a commitment as well. It's not just like and it's not like watching Netflix, you know, where you know it's rated whatever, because you listen to a story and you never know where it goes. So you have to be alert, you know. When you binge watch stuff at Netflix, you always know it's, even if you don't pay attention for 10 minutes, you don't lose the plot, right? With listening to people, it's different, you know. You have to be alert. You are in diet basically. And what I want to do with Lebenswerk AI is for those who didn't have the time to listen when people were ready to talk, and for those who didn't know that listening is important when people had the time, I want for those people to preserve knowledge, you know. So I have this I've generated a visual which is let me just show this here, because I think it's a very powerful thing that we are using every now and then. Just a second, I'll be right with you, because it says a lot about the listening aspects and what we are trying to, what we're trying to make people embrace. Let me just share this with you here real quick.
I'm not entirely sure if we can call this cliffhanger, Tobias, but
No,
it's
no,
close.
yeah,
Okay.
no, it's okay. It's okay. Here, let me just show this to you here. I needed to pull the presentation, and I have it right here with me, and I can. I'm not used to Zoom, so that's my point. Okay, does it work?
Well, you've started screen sharing, but we cannot
No,
see.
it doesn't work. It's not the right. It's not the one that I wanted you to see.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry for that. I don't know. Do you see that one? Oh, you see. No, you don't. Okay, sorry. So what you see there basically is a person leaving the table with a candle that is still has the smoke. So it's like for those who are not there anymore, to be able to leave something that at another point in time people will pick up and then will appreciate and cherish this. It's probably not good for the storyteller, but it's good for those people who want to complete their grandfather's or grandmother's view of life.
Yeah. Veron, being mindful of that same question.
Yeah, I have a very different take on these questions. Is I find that this listening and the listener is whoever care about that stories, they will listen. And I think the problems right now is when story is not being seen as important to people and people stop listening. And that is the perspective I start to see when I start working with governments or public health, is like, whose story matters, who is receiving that information? Is it just noise or things that will change the way of how I deliver the service or shaping the policies? And something that I see as a future of storytelling in the space of design or innovations, or even governments start to adopting a much more human-centric approach, is actually like having a really good conversations about whose story matters and who need to receiving it. And something on the space of academia or my practice we start to look into is decentralize the design process. And something we start to see is when human-centric design start to lend to government or public health is we give the skills and the technique to very senior people, the leadership. And some of them, they learn the skills. Some of them, they start to see like, oh, this is great, that have values about it. The trouble is the day-to-day of the interactions of people who receive the story, who listen to the stories, are far apart from people who see the potential of these stories. And so what I see as an opportunity as a design educator or in my practice is start to really taking the design power away from the consultancy model. Like, don't see it as a project, see it as a culture change, see it as like, how do we have conversations with people? It's not just about listening to people venting. It's actually, they might be sharing golden nuggets to you, to thinking about what will be a better service to provide to people. But most importantly is people at the front line. I don't know about other countries, but I think like from what I see in, for many countries that we are struggling the workforce in the front lines. We don't have enough people, and I definitely see it as an opportunity of giving the skills to people in the front line to see it as a new capacity building, new engagement building of you're also learning additional skills, not just about interacting with people as a frontline to public services, but you have a skills that will be shaping not only the people's life, but also a skills that you can see it apply in many, many other arena or in the future of your career as well. So that's where I see the listening part is first step is like story matters. How can we start to introducing story matters? But at the same time, decentralizing where the story need to be told, who owns the story, who tells the story, who received the story, who have agency to do something with that stories. If you're in the front line, you receive that story, do you just take it as like, okay, someone shares something with me? Or actually, there is a way of mechanism of reporting this story of like, hey, we missed the opportunity of how we can improve the design of the mental health clinic. Or we missed the opportunity of like how people self-refer to the healthcare systems. Like, how do we actually mobilizing this process to make story matters? It's not just about percentage of discharge or like number of people who don't require medications. I think there are additional data points. We need to look into it. And so the role of listening is not just about like who listen, because I do think when people see the importance of this data point, people will listen. And not only listening, but actually people can do something with what they listen to it, which is the missed opportunity I can see is that really open up this process of people sharing data that can form and shape the better of the healthcare of the services, not only for few people, but for many people.
Absolutely. Now, one of the challenges sometimes of stories is that they have an end. And in this case, we have a final word maybe from you, Haley. And I think maybe also, though, that we're slightly moving towards Tobias, another great story that we do not have time for today, but it's the value of storytelling also in a democracy. But Haley, how do we ensure that when we listen, that, or rather when we encourage more storytelling, that we ensure that there are people that are listening?
Yeah, great question. For us, it's about how do we get the story to as many people as possible to increase the reach of each individual story. So looking at having a digital distribution mechanism can be incredibly helpful for making a story accessible. We also think intentionally about how do we encourage people to thoughtfully listen? Because we live in a time where there's so much information that we're being inundated with day in and day out. And so encouraging people to use story as a mirror and a self-reflective tool to not just watch a story and take it in for what it is externally, but to really process what is it that I related to in this story? How do I see myself reflected back at me through this person? What common experiences, common feelings, emotions, pain points have we navigated, and how do I use that as a way of better understanding myself? I think to the earlier point around who is telling the story and whose stories are we listening to, we always also think about 3 main audiences for every story. The first audience is the person who relates to that story. So a person with similar lived experience who sees themselves reflected back at them, who feels less alone. The second audience is the person who supports the person who relates to the story, who is in their circle of care, whether it's family, whether it's teachers, whether it's mental health providers. How do we encourage the storyteller's extended community and those who would relate to that story's extended community to better understand the perspective of someone in their life through that story? So if you've never had, you've never experienced your own mental health journey, maybe around depression or anxiety or thoughts of suicide, how do we use that story to better understand someone in your life who does navigate those experiences? And the third audience that we're always looking to connect with is the people who make the decisions around the storyteller's experience. So that could be policymakers, that's our researchers, that's our clinical care providers. How do we use story as a way of increasing their empathy, their understanding, so that the decisions that they're making around care are more informed by lived experience? Because so much of our system is designed and delivered from 500,000 feet away from the person who is navigating access. And so how can we use story to bridge data and to make numbers real to people? Because we hear statistics all the time. We hear 1 in 5 people struggle with this, 25% of that, 55% of this, but it doesn't mean anything until we attach a human experience to it. That's the thing that motivates us to make change. That's the thing that mobilizes us to look at a situation differently. And it's about not just looking for ourselves in someone else's story as a way of seeing ourselves, but it's a way of seeing ourselves reflected back at us through someone who's very different from us, so that we build that level of compassion and empathy for their experience. Because it's so easy to write a narrative about someone we don't know. It's easy to define who we think they are, what we think their intentions are, what we think their motivations are, versus listening to a real story of lived experience and seeing the humanity in what and who they are as a person, and using that to guide decision making.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful experience of traveling through several both snippets of stories and doorways into even more stories about our society and the way that we use storytelling across different organizations and in different ways. As you may have seen in the track, in the chat, Ron, one of our participants, Jennifer, has been kind enough to also share her email from her professional quest to put a dent in the loneliness epidemic, which is a wonderful way, I think, of also expressing that journey in almost just half a sentence. So kudos to you, Jenny, for doing that. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will be, of course, at one point editing this video slightly and then sending it out to our global audience to allow them to also dive into storytelling. And I think, though, that we can also promise ourselves that we should get another chapter to this book at one point so that we can explore even more stories. It does take time to do so fully, but it's fun and interesting all the way. Thank you.